Welcome to the second installment on industrialization. And as we see the growth of big business during the late 1800s, a new way to manage these new businesses were created. And the new plan of business organization became known as the trust. A board of trustees would manage these businesses because they became so complex. And with that, we see companies kind of merging and growing, and in fact, they were creating these monopolies, and different business structures kind of varied. Some kind of took on a horizontal integration, and others a vertical integration. And an example of vertical integration was Andrew Carnegie with his Carnegie Steel. Now, what vertical integration means is that Carnegie was able to control every step of the process in making steel, whether it be from owning the raw material or the iron ore fields to ships or railroads to transport it to the coal fields where it could be melted down into steel. He owned every step, and therefore he didn't have to rely on other companies and kind of lose profits that way. And whereas in 1874, the U.S. produced less than one half the pig iron of Britain, by 1900, just Carnegie's company alone made more steel than all of Britain. So this Scottish immigrant who came to America at the age of 13 and took his first job at making $1.20 a week as a bobbin boy eventually becomes one of the richest men in America. And so here you can see how Carnegie really becomes, the king of steel, as the output of steel in America skyrockets with his leadership and entrepreneurship. Now, for an example of horizontal integration, we have John D. Rockefeller with his Standard Oil. He had his first oil refinery in 1870, which had about maybe 10% of the oil business. But 12 years later, by 1882, he had amassed a near monopoly on oil in the U.S. and controlled over 90% of the oil pipelines. Now, eventually, this will lead to anti-monopoly laws to try to cut down on the unfair business practices, but that's something we'll take a look at in the future. But Rockefeller had made his riches in oil, and eventually he becomes the world's richest man, and will actually use horizontal and vertical integration, as he'll also control refineries, barrel making, warehouses, holding tanks, and all the things that would be needed to create this oil empire. And so one thing that really characterizes this era is the number of corporate mergers. And as you can kind of see it spike here in the late 1800s, in fact, 1% of the United States companies controlled over 1/3 of all industrial production. So these big businesses kept getting bigger through these mergers. And to help facilitate these mergers, you needed financing and big banks. And one of the most prominent men in financing became J.P. Morgan, who helped finance the purchase of Carnegie Steel, eventually created U.S. Steel, which becomes the first billion-dollar company. But these investors and bankers were the ones that provided huge sums of money to facilitate these great transactions. And yet we still see at this time kind of most of the industrial growth was still concentrated in New England, where by 1890, more than 85% of all U.S. manufactured goods were produced here, as the South still lagged behind as they were trying to still recover from the Civil War. And with that, you can see by 1900, we have more billionaires arising, many coming from railroads, inheritance, and financing. But if we look just a few short 18 years later, we see that even though financing is still there for billionaires, that steel and oil had risen. And that's not to be a surprise, as those two products are used to transport and build just about everything that was going on. However, even though we have a lot of business growth and industry booming, we still have kind of a mixed feeling on how things truly are. These men that created great wealth and lived these opulent lifestyles were kind of known as the captains of industry. People who provided businesses and therefore jobs for the millions of people living in the U.S. and still coming to the U.S. But a more negative connotation for these men was the term robber barons, because they grew rich at the expense of the workers. For it was these workers that toiled away in long hours and low-paying jobs. They didn't have any time off or sick days. There was no unemployment or workers' compensation, and they were working in very unsafe conditions. And so, even though business was booming, life wasn't always that great for the majority of Americans. But not only that, Thomas Jefferson's greatest fears kind of play out a little bit here, because we see these big corporations sometimes maybe influencing politics, causing corruption, or getting different laws passed to kind of favor their big companies and big money, and therefore rewarding these political leaders with financing and support. And so there were other issues that were raised, and we will take a look at future chapters at how we try to clean up this corruption. But even though many people thought these robber barons grew rich at their workers' expense, Andrew Carnegie talked about in his Gospel of Wealth about how these wealthy and industrialists should give back to communities and people. For he wrote that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. And in fact, he gave away over $350 million before he dies, including building over 2,500 public libraries around the United States. And he wasn't the only captain of industry to do this. Others like John D. Rockefeller did as well. He gave away over $900 million by 1912, including building the University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, and funding the Rockefeller Foundation. So many of these industrialists kind of followed Carnegie's advice. And as you can see here, the United States didn't just rival, but surpassed all other countries when it came to the world's manufacturing output, as we continue to produce more and more goods, something that today we're trying to get back to. And as our manufacturing grew, we needed less workers in the fields as new technologies were developed and we became more efficient at farming. And we needed more workers in manufacturing and commerce. And you can see those sectors kind of continue to grow, and that's what helped spur on this huge immigration of individuals to the United States to try to look for jobs and to better their lives. But as more people kept entering into manufacturing and construction and building, we see labor union membership continue to grow. As I had alluded to earlier, these conditions were horrible. And as people continue to work in them, they continue to deteriorate. And so over time, we see unions start to grow and strengthen and start to demand change in the workplace. And that's something that you'll be reading about, is these conditions of these workers, the creation of these unions like the Knights of Labor in 1869, or the AFL, which is the American Federation of Labor, in 1886, which was a craft union led by Samuel Gompers, somebody that we'll discuss in class. But then we'll also take a look at, once these unions form, where is their labor unrest and what happens. And therefore we'll take a look at some of the great strikes, like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Homestead Strike of 1892, as well as the Haymarket riot and Pullman strike, both that took place in Chicago. But these are all things that we'll discuss further in class. But thanks for joining us on this lesson on U.S. industrialization.